it's Miss Chaton, and today what we're going to be talking about is the pseudoscience around the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard situation. Now, pseudoscience is defined as a system of theories, assumptions, and methods erroneously regarded as scientific. When it comes to this case, I'm seeing such a volume of it, it's frankly blowing my mind. Pseudoscience is also commonly referred to as broscience because it happens to share initials with bull, and it's really an adventure as a woman in this society, seeing all the different changes that have been kind of coming about lately as far as women's position in this society and our legal status and all of that. And it's also interesting watching people all join hands decide that they're going to stop pretending they believe in any kind of actual science when it applies to anything, that's inconvenient, like things that happen to women a lot. Now, the two main types of pseudoscience I've seen floating around with this Johnny Depp defamation trial, because it's worth keeping in mind that she has not brought him to court for anything ever, unless you count filing for a divorce and getting a restraining order. He has just repeatedly sued her for alluding, however vaguely, to having been a survivor of some kind of thing that happened somewhere at some point in her life. The two main kinds that sort of show up in this case are body language analysis and completely nonsensical diagnoses. Now, the first one I'm going to hit on is body language analysis. What body language analysis purports to do is to take someone's body language, so their facial expressions, they call them micro expressions, like little things you might do with your face, like, if someone gets annoyed, they might purse their lips, or if someone's amused, they might smirk a little, that kind of thing, and observable physiological sorts of things, like, whether they start speeding up their speech and talking more quickly, or slowing it down and talking more slowly, or the rate of a person's blinking, things like that. It's a thing that people think that based off of observing someone's body language, if you know what you're doing well enough, you can tell whether they're lying or not. And to an extent, there's some element of truth to that. When people, are not very conscious of their body language, they might give themselves away in different ways, or even if they are and they're actually trained in presenting themselves a certain way, they might just be overcome with some degree of emotion and give themselves away in some way. But the biggest problem with body language analysis is that there are multiple reasons why people might do different physiological things. And specifically, when you're trying to use body language analysis to determine whether or not someone's being truthful in some kind of stressful situation, it's going to be thrown off, because most of our physiological tells for when we're being deceptive overlap pretty closely with our physiological response to just being stressed or nervous or anxious. And, while it's true that for most people, they're more likely to feel some level of, anxiety or agitation or stress or something like that in a situation where they're not telling the truth, that's not universally true. For example, a person might believe they're telling the truth and not be telling the truth, in which case they'll be perfectly calm. A person might convince themselves of their lies, in which case they effectively believe they're telling the truth, so they're perfectly calm when they're telling lies. A person might be a trained liar, like an actor or an actress or something, and they can be perfectly calm when they're telling lies if they choose to consciously adopt a certain mean when they're talking. A person might be trained by public relations professionals or have gone to charm school or different sorts of things like that, and naturally they'll have learned the ability to restrain or inhibit their natural reactions to things. And it's also worth adding any kind of situation where there's a lot on the line and there's a lot of attention, like being on the stand or giving a deposition, is a situation where a person, regardless of whether they're telling the truth or they're lying, is likely to feel stressed and anxious. So, under those circumstances, even to the extent that it is possible to, using someone's body language, determine whether or not they're telling the truth, and that's not super possible, you're just going to be thrown off by the circumstances. So the ocean of videos that are analyzing every expression, micro-expression, blink, how many blinks, how quickly she blinks, whether her rate of blinking slows down or speeds up, whether she purses her lips or pouts or frowns or furrows her brow or whatever, are just videos where people are giving their opinions of how they think she's reacting to things. And a last big point with body language analysis is that for any given emotion, even within the same person in the same situation, they won't necessarily display it the same way. For example, a lot of people have pointed out that in some of the audio where Johnny Depp and Amber Heard are arguing, one or the other of them is laughing, and said, that's evidence whatever person that person is talking about at the moment isn't actually angry. Laughing is not an uncommon reaction to anger. That's like saying that the fact that someone's crying is proof that they're not happy. Well, boy, just learned a lot about weddings, People sometimes laugh when they're angry. Sometimes people go silent when they're angry. Sometimes people get louder when they're angry. Sometimes people get creepily calm when they're angry. Everyone's different. Sometimes even the same person, depending on what they're angry about, how angry they are, whether they get angry when they're drunk, or this is a situation in which they're drinking, what the specific situation is, might react differently. So whether someone's smiling or frowning or furrowing their brow or crying or whatever, certain expressions can indicate that a person is feeling emotional in some way. Like, you can pretty fairly guess that a person who is crying is feeling some strong emotion. You can fairly guess that if there's like a large change in someone's facial expression, that indicates they're feeling something. If you see someone who looks like they're smiling, it might indicate amusement. It might indicate irritation. Okay. Like, it could indicate anger. Oh, really? It could indicate a lot of things. People are complex. And it's also possible, because emotions are complex, to be feeling more than one thing at the same time. And the subtleties of the different emotions can quickly flit across your face in a variety of different ways. So basically all there is really to say about these body language analysis videos is, while they might occasionally accurately capture something, for the most part, it's just a person, for however long they're analyzing a video, giving you their opinions about whoever it is they're talking about, and then justifying them with whatever happens to their face if you point a camera at their face long enough. And another lovely bit of pseudoscience, in this case that I'm seeing an awful lot of, is nonsensical diagnoses. And one thing that's worth saying about psychiatry, just like as a field and as a history, is a lot of feminists over the years have talked about the entire field being an institution that exists within a greater patriarchy, having a tendency to perpetuate misogyny. And, you know, there's some like kind of greater trends that contribute to that and some more specific ones. And when we talk about the history of psychiatry and we talk about how this field impacts women, well, the father of modern psychiatry is Sigmund Freud. And one thing that I've learned about Sigmund Freud is a lot of fathers came to him because they were having problems with their daughters. You know, they were acting out in some way. Maybe they like weren't doing housework, or they were sleeping, or maybe they were weeping, or maybe they were running around screaming their heads off, or maybe they just stopped talking entirely and they were selectively mute or something, right? And in kind of observing these girls and taking notes and things like that, even most modern, practitioners would agree that he was pretty accurate about, how symptoms tended to present and that kind of a thing. But where we had a bit of a breakdown was when we got around to deciding where they came from. Because a legal thing is that in those times, male sort of guardians of women had the right to access all of their, medical information, including psychiatric information. So, whether it's like a married woman with a husband or an unmarried woman with her father, any notes from a psychiatrist he could view. If he wanted to talk to this person and find out anything that she'd said, he could find out anything she'd said, that kind of a thing. There was no sort of expectation of privacy. Or if they expected it, then they wound up being sorely disappointed because it wasn't granted. So he observed a lot of these, predominantly young women who were troubled in varying ways, or at least were determined to be by some male relative that, put her in front of him to be troubled in some way. And what the majority of these girls kept saying was that they had been sexually accosted or bothered in some way, shape, or form by their fathers, if you gather what I'm saying. Kept hearing that over and over and over again. Oftentimes it said it was their father, sometimes another male relative or something like that, but some kind of sexual problem thing happened, according to these women. And one can only theorize what led him to conclude this way, but I'll say I've encountered a number of writers who share this hunch that I have, that when the person that's paying him and the person who has, access to whatever it is he has to say, and especially if they're paying big money and their endorsement and ability to induce some sort of improvement in the young women that are troubling them so is on the line, says, oh no, it must be false memory syndrome and they're all making this up. Or it could be the Electra complex, which is essentially the opposite of Oedipal complex, and it proposes that women tend to fancy their fathers. So if they believe that they've been bothered by them in some way, it's really just like fantasizing, that kind of thing. That's very convenient, right? It kind of kills two birds with one stone. You don't make your actual client, the person who's paying you, unhappy, and if you're successful, then you can gaslight your patient into thinking that they've just made up what other memories are troubling them so. And, hopefully there's enough gaslight to light that thing up and lead them out of the darkness. And the concept of false memory syndrome has really stuck around. And one place I've definitely seen it pop up is in the trial of Miss Amber Heard. Sure, they didn't say false memory syndrome, just like they didn't say that she's a hysteric. But it was very strongly implied. And as far as where it was implied, that would be by Dr. Shannon Curry. Ms. Curry got on the stand and she had quite a bit to say. According to Ms. Curry, Amber Heard is a highly disturbed individual. She does not have PTSD or any significant symptoms of trauma. If she reports that she has these things, it's because she's confused and mistaken. And the reason she's confused and mistaken is primarily a combination of her diagnosis of borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder, which result from her childhood abuse. That's quite a doozy. And, as Mr. Curry very authoritatively informed everyone, women who have borderline personality disorder are seductive, they're manipulative, they're quarrelsome, they're impulsive, they're known to rage out and lash out. Whole big bag of bad, right? Okay. And then we have histrionic personality disorder. And histrionic personality disorder is kind of like borderline, except the biggest distinguishing thing with that is that as a contrast to the sort of primary injury with borderline personality disorder being a fear of abandonment, the primary injury associated with histrionic personality is a need for attention. So, histrionic women, because we don't diagnose men with that, histrionic women tend to, make up things and confabulate things, and when they're not making things up, they're imagining things or they're exaggerating real things in a way to get some sort of attention. In particular, they're known to injure themselves or threaten to end their time on this planet in order to get people to pay attention to them. Now, the first thing to note about histrionic personality disorder is that it comes from the same root word as hysteria and hysterectomy. Hyster, your uterus. And in fact, up until 1969, I believe, you could just straight up be diagnosed as a hysteric. And then they changed the language so that the old diagnosis of hysteria became histrionic personality disorder, but it is a diagnosis of hysteria. And we're left with this absolute pseudoscientific nonsense being presented as if it's science. So someone is getting on the stand and saying it's science. And here's the best part. Now, Dr. Curry issued two tests, right? The MMPI and a CAPS. And basically, she was trying to, there were two things that she was trying to figure out with her testing. According to Hidden True Crime podcasts, who kind of went into explaining this, one of those tests was to determine if she had a personality disorder, and the other test was to determine if she had PTSD. because essentially it's pretty central to Depp's claims that the reason she's making these allegedly false allegations is because she has a personality disorder, and it's central to Heard's claims that she has post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from the abuse she faced at Depp's hands. So it's kind of two birds with one stone if he can hire somebody who will basically say, yes, she does have this thing that benefits my case, and no, she does not have this thing that benefits her case. And that's exactly the conclusion she came up with. And rather interestingly, when I was watching a video on the Hidden True Crime podcast YouTube channel, one of the members of that podcast is a forensic psychologist, and this person went on to kind of outline the methodology for forensic psychology and the usual methods that they would use for coming to a conclusion in a similar kind of case. And what this person essentially wound up saying is that in order to the best of their ability, ensure whatever conclusions they come to are accurate, forensic psychologists are tasked with taking in as much information as possible, and, in addition to looking at everything that is available associated with the case as far as evidence and depositions and affidavits and exhibits and all these kinds of things. Also, what they want to do is interview as many sort of relevant individuals as is practically possible for them to do, and administer tests. And he said for himself personally, in a case like this, he would probably administer between 15 and 20 tests. Dr. Curry administered 2. That was enough to kind of blow my mind. But when he went on to talk a bit more about it, it frankly blew my mind even further. And that kind of moves us to our second forensic psychologist in the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard extravaganza, and that would be Dr. Hughes. And now Dr. Hughes is very experienced, and she's also worked with a few prominent DV sexual bothering kind of cases. Two of the best known are certainly with R. Kelly and with the NXIVM cult with Keith Raniere and all of that, that wound up scooping up Allison Maxim from Smallville. And as I was kind of thinking earlier about this case and what potentially wound up either attracting her to this case or attracting Miss Heard's team to reach out to this particular professional for this case is, this is one of those weird kinds of situations where, much like with R. Kelly, you had a, primary abuser, and then you had a lot of people around him enabling things, covering things up, fabricating different kinds of information and that sort of thing in order to keep everything covered up and that sort of thing. To take a quick digression to the R. Kelly case, this wound up being a whole kind of conspiracy thing with like RICO charges and that sort of thing, because it wasn't just him doing what he was doing. There were people in his employ that were procuring people. There were people in his employ that were involved in trafficking people. There were people in his employ that were, providing substances. of an illicit nature. There was someone in his employ that rather infamously helped Aaliyah to forge her age so that he could marry her at 15 when she was allegedly pregnant. There were people in his employ that helped hold these women captive while they were captive, helped kind of take care of them and that sort of thing. So it wound up being a situation where there wasn't one man that was guilty of some offense. There was a whole network of people guilty of a network of offenses. And, another sidebar with the Nexium case, Nexium, something like that. In case you're unfamiliar, Keith Raniere was the ringleader as his sort of right-hand woman. He'd taken Allison Mack and essentially sufficiently brainwashed her that she was kind of a co-abuser to a cohort of other women. These women were, enslaved sexually. These women were, in a manner of speaking, trafficked to, other men within this sort of enterprise. Like with R. Kelly case, there were other people implicated that were involved in sort of corralling, controlling, silencing these women. In this case, there was a lot of financial abuse, so, they wound up kind of giving up all their belongings to the cult, wound up quitting their jobs for the cult, that kind of a thing. There were no criminal charges yet associated with this adventure with Mr. Depp, but I'm aware that of the, I believe, 5 or 6 instances of sexual assault that Amber Heard has alleged, at least 2 of them occurred in places, when I checked, were still within the statute of limitations, so this can still proceed to a criminal trial. And I have heard, at least in the case of Australia, that there are already officials kind of keep an eye on this, and if he winds up losing this case, which I predict he will, then there's a chance the DA in Australia will pick up a criminal proceeding because of the event she alleges took place in Australia. But nevertheless, that's who Dr. Hughes is, right? She's got over 15 years experience. She's worked with hundreds of people who have, been subject to domestic violence. And by comparison, Dr. Curry has never worked on a domestic violence case until this one. So that's a pretty big, flashing red sign. And what I wound up seeing that I didn't expect with Dr. Hughes was that she outright basically tossed right in the bin what Dr. Curry had diagnosed Amber Heard with. And I thought that was interesting until I watched her explain why. And then I was just like, what? And interestingly enough, when this forensic psychologist from this podcast I was watching was talking about the case, he wound up very strongly agreeing with Dr. Hughes' findings. The first thing that kind of jumped out at me after the sort of explanation of the necessity of giving a lot of tests and talking to a lot of people is that Dr. Curry only gave 2 tests, which is extraordinary, and she didn't really talk to anybody except Johnny Depp, and this person noted that actually she shouldn't have talked to Johnny Depp because an expert witness is someone who's hired by the legal team, not by the plaintiff or defendant themselves, and essentially you're not supposed to have he called them dual relationships with clients, which means that you're not supposed to have a relationship outside a professional context. So, essentially it was a huge ethics violation to even have this sort of like informal dinner and drinks kind of interaction with this person, like at all. So I thought that was interesting. And, another thing that kind of caught my attention was when he was explaining the scoring of the scales from the MMPI. And basically, Dr. Curry said that she was a 3-6 code type. And this person went on to explain what that meant, and also Dr. Hughes did. And essentially, it means that on that test, your score 3 and score 6 are elevated, with score 3 being at least 5 points higher. And score 3 is your hysteria score, and score 6 is your paranoia score. The fact that the most commonly used test in this field is one that was created in 1947, and it has a literal hysteria scale. So you can get a hysteria score on your personality test, is enough to just remind me how this whole sort of like psychiatry action adventure saga has just deep roots of misogyny woven into it in a real nasty, ugly little way. But like, doing my best to move past that and focus on the main point here. Something Dr. Hughes said that this other forensic psychologist concurred with was that in order for it to be considered at a level where some kind of diagnosis is appropriate, you need to score above 65. And according to Dr. Hughes, on none of the scales, including 3 and 6, did Amber Heard score above a 65, which meant she scored within the normal range and she shouldn't have been diagnosed with anything. And the fact that her highest scores were in the 3 and 6 scales doesn't really mean anything if neither of them were actually high enough to register as abnormal in some way, if neither of them were actually high enough to be above 65. So essentially, Dr. Curry administered a test. It showed up that she was completely normal, and then she said, well, if she did have an issue, the closest one would be this one, because these are the 2 scores that are the highest, even though neither of them are high enough to diagnose her with anything other than absolutely nothing. And that just reminded me of a passage from one of my favorite authors. Her name is Mary Daly. This is her book, Pure Lust. She was a feminist philosopher. She's passed now. And she has a really interesting way of wording things. And I'm just going to read off a little bit here. The witch prickers parodied hydromancy, which is divination by means of signs derived from water, its tides and ebbs. This was most obviously accomplished through ordeal by water, or swimming. The test required first restraining the accused by tying the hands and feet together, often with the right thumb on the left big toe, so that the witch was cross-bound. Then the accused woman was thrown into deep water 3 times if necessary. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. In the latter instance, she usually drowned, unless her torturers decided to rescue her. Here is a classic manifestation of the doublethink decreed by drones, which we can summarize in the maxim: if you win, you lose. If you lose, you lose. The fallacies of their own ill logic were lost upon the ledgers who promoted such perverse divination by water. King James I pompously proclaimed, "So it appears that God hath appointed for a supernatural sign of the monstrous impiety of witches, that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom, that have shaken off them the sacred water of baptism, and wilfully refuse the benefit thereof." Although water is not commonly used by today's witch prickers, psychiatry torturers do commonly use the heads I win, tails you lose approach to determining mental illness. In his classic comparison of modern psychiatry with witch-finding, Thomas Zaz remarks that in all his years of psychiatric work, "I have never known a clinical psychologist to report, on the basis of a projective test, that the subject is a, quote, normal, mentally healthy person. While some witches may have survived dunking, no madman survives psychological testing." And that reminds me a lot of what I'm watching with Amber Heard, particularly with the notion of being thrice dunked. The first time she was dunked was when, after leaving Johnny Depp, she sought a protective order. They said, "We need to see evidence." She showed evidence because court proceedings are public. This became available to the public, so it was reported upon, even though she did not make any public statement on this, and she was granted the protective order. First time, which survives. Then the second time, we come to the trial in the UK last year, Johnny Depp sues the Sun for reporting upon the previous allegations made by Miss Heard, although again, saying she made allegations feels like a push when all she actually did was file for a protective order, and she had to detail incidents that gave the court reason to think she was in actual physical danger of some kind. But nevertheless, the Sun reported on them. Johnny Depp sued the Sun. The Sun, seeking to protect itself from a libel claim, sought out Amber Heard for assistance in proving that what they said about Johnny Depp, that he was abusive, was true. Ms. Heard presented 15 separate instances, 14 of physical violence of some kind, and then the 15th was a private judgment which contained, some sort of sexual allegations. Right. We didn't know at the time that's what they were, but now we know that's what they were. And, I mean, you could gather the implication that's what they were, because a former assistant of Amber Heard's, who testified on Johnny Depp's behalf, claimed that Amber stole her sexual assault story for, I guess, her private judgment or whatever. But the reason this woman's testimony was thrown out was that when she was asked if she had read what was in the private judgment, so if she actually knew specifically what Amber was alleging, she said no. So either this woman was being blatantly dishonest, or she was under the sincere belief that there's no way that she had been assaulted in some way, and also at some point Amber Heard could have been assaulted in some way without her stealing her story. So based off of that claim, you could guess that the private judgment contained something of a sexual nature, but I don't really remember anyone really talking about that because we didn't know it was in the private judgment, and we were far more distracted by the judge finding Johnny Depp guilty of 12 counts of domestic battery. That was kind of more distracting than what was in the mystery 15th claim. And then, of course, there were the two that the judge said there wasn't enough evidence to come to one conclusion or another on, which means that anybody who thinks the judge automatically accepts all of her claims without sufficient evidence doesn't have anything to back that up. But nevertheless, it was determined that the Sun did not libel Mr. Depp, even though, because of the UK laws, the burden of proof wasn't on the plaintiff, it was on the defendant. And even with the higher burden of proof, the son managed to prevail in this lawsuit. Boom! Survived the second dunking. Let's dunk this witch again. Time for an appeal. And on appeal, a third judge found Johnny Depp to have been guilty of having repeatedly assaulted his former wife. And then Johnny Depp goes after the Washington Post for printing an op-ed in which she doesn't name him, describe any specific incidents, give any sorts of dates or timelines. And the title mentions an type of allegation she has not made publicly against him. But nevertheless, he said it must be about him, and decided to sue her again, even though it already had 3 judges say that he'd assaulted her. He decided he's going to sue her again for saying she assaulted him, even though she didn't even say that he did. So here we are for the 4th time in a court about the same allegation. Forensic psychology has all the problems all psychology has that I just sort of listed. It's an institution within a patriarchy, and when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? It also has the problems that just sort of come from people be peoplein'. Like, for example, Dr. Hughes talked about the fact that when you're assessing these sorts of tests, you need to factor in trauma. And when you're giving structured interviews about people's traumatic experiences, then you need to ask specific questions when you're talking about traumatic symptoms. For example, when you're talking about flashbacks, you want to ask not just have you had any or how many of them, but what is the content of this flashback? What are you flashing back to? When you talk about nightmares, you don't just want to ask, have you had nightmares? You want to ask, what were the nightmares about? So that you can attach them to a specific event. And she also talked about how certain scores are likely to be elevated if a person has some kind of trauma. So when you're evaluating the scores and trying to determine if they have a personality disorder, you're supposed to factor that in. When she talked about a personality disorder diagnosis, one of the things she said was that you don't just look at what numbers the test spits out, what score the test spits out. You also want to look to see whether these patterns are present in other relationships and other time periods under other circumstances. And an example of this that she gave was that, if a person has borderline personality disorder, then this impulsiveness is going to be present in other areas of their life. It'll show up in their professional decisions, it'll show up in their financial decisions, that kind of a thing. If a person has a pattern of emotional dysregulation, they won't just be dysregulated dealing with one person. That'll show up in their other romantic relationships, that'll show up in their family relationships, that'll show up in their professional relationships. And another thing is, this pattern of black and white thinking, either loving and hating, attaching and discarding, that kind of sort of highly dramatic thing, you're going to see not just in a relationship with one partner, but across their relationships. And what was interesting to me about that was all of those sound like things you can fairly diagnose Johnny Depp with. Let's just grab that and say that's our criteria here, right? For example, as far as patterns repeating across relationships with other people, when it comes to the jealousy and the paranoia, Jennifer Grey reported the same sort of thing. When you talk about the timber episodes and the destruction of property and that kind of a thing, in addition to Amber Heard reporting that, Jennifer Grey reporting that, Ellen Barkin reporting that, Kate Moss also having that experience, having, like, had to call the police because he was trashing, like, her hotel room at one point. Also, as far as professionally, he has assaulted crew members, he's assaulted photographers, he's, according to Jennifer Gray, assaulted police officers and gotten into bar fights. So that pattern of violence seems to be pretty pervasive and not isolated to this relationship. As far as, like, impulsiveness of spending, like, I've heard he's said himself he spends something like $30,000 a month on wine. He's bought, like, private islands and has, like, 12 residences or something like that. His own forensic accountant said that, like, he's had enough income that if he was not reckless with his spending, he would be fine. So, I mean, even his own people say he's kind of reckless with that. Professionally, there were disagreements with his main sort of source of steady income in the Pirates franchise. Lots of, like, creative differences. He was showing up to set hours late, intoxicated. It was costing a lot, but he had to have an earpiece that was feeding him lines, and his own, like, sort of, like, audio engineer dealing with that. Like, some people that had, like, small, like, indie movies and things like that, they brought him in, would talk about having to spend as much as, like, $3 million dealing with that kind of thing from him. So it's pretty, you know, apparent that sort of eroticism seems to be, like, a pattern, like, across his life and relationships. And, you know, as far as, you know, accusing people of cheating, that kind of a thing, and, like, lots of, like, sort of jealousy, that's something Jennifer Gray talked about that. I believe that Vanessa Paradis is, like, sort of vaguely alluded to that. You know, that seems to be kind of a pattern here. And as far as attention-seeking behavior and self-injury, we've heard the audio where he demands that Amber Heard cut him, and she is like, no, I'm not going to do that, and he's, like, begging her to, and he's like, please, I have nothing left, and she ultimately refuses, and also asks him to stop cutting himself. And he's spoken of his self-injury before, and, you know, said that his body's like a map of self-harm scars or something, you know, pseudo-poetic, like how he likes to express things. So we know he does engage in self-injury. He cut off his own finger. He said she did it. That was just proven to be a lie. There's audio where he admits to doing it. Like, that's just what that is. Like, he did that, okay? In addition to audio where he admits to having done it, there are text messages to Paul Bettany and to his doctor where he admitted to having done it. He apologized to her for scaring the bedevil out of her by doing it. It's just true that he did that, alright, you guys? Like, sorry anyone who wants to believe she cut his finger off, or, like, pulled a Jackie Chan move and, like, precision hit with a bottle or something. Didn't happen. He cut his finger off, y'all. So, you know, self-interest behavior for attention. That's a thing he checks the box for. Refusing to take responsibility for any of his actions, even though Amber Heard has admitted to, from the very beginning of this, like, has admitted to, you know, having struck and on occasions, like, thrown objects at him during confrontations or in response to something he did or something like that. Regardless of the reason, she's admitted she's done it. He's never admitted to doing anything. In fact, he got on the stand and he said he has never in any way verbally, physically, emotionally, or sexually abused a woman. He's a Southern gentleman and he has never put his hands on a woman. That's what came out of his mouth. Now, in cross-examination, when they presented him with evidence that he has indeed done this, including confessions that he's given in private to Amber that he's done this, well, then he says, oh, it's retaliation, she gives as good as she gets, it's mutual abuse. However, he doesn't actually, without being directly caught lying, admit to having done it, and on a few occasions, even when directly confronted, lies. Like, there's some audio where you can hear Amber going, "Get off me, stop it, get off me." And he says, loudly, and it sounds like he's talking to someone else, "Anyway, I'll see you later." And when he's asked about this audio, he says that he didn't hear her say, "Get off me," which was weird, because even if he didn't hear her in the moment, why didn't he hear her when they played the recording? I heard it. But whatever. So yeah, doesn't take responsibility for his actions, and he's accused Amber of putting out cigarettes on him. However, there is audio of Amber angrily asking him to put his cigarettes out on someone else, and him responding, "Shut up, fat ass," which doesn't sound like, "What are you talking about? You put cigarettes out on me," at all. There's lots of audio of her accusing him of things and him agreeing with him and that kind of a thing, or just like not contesting it, just move on and talking about something else. Things that A goes on in court to say that he didn't do, never did, or straight up say that she did. That's a choice. So we've also got refusal to take responsibility for our actions. There's one audio where he confronts her about having thrown something at him, and her response is to basically be like, "Yeah, I did that." And then he's like, "Isn't that crazy? It's psychotic and terrible." And she's like, "Yeah, but like, now we're just kind of quibbling over who did what, Johnny," basically. And then he goes on to say, "And I only did that because you blah, 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 blah." Okay, so you kind of halfway admitted something, but still blamed her for it. Specifically blamed her for a thing you did. So like, the one time he outright admits to something when he isn't crying or begging her not to leave him, is when he's still blaming her for like making him do it. Very like, "Look what you made me do." Honestly, a lot of his interactions with her are very, "Look what you made me do." And you know, any kind of real analysis of these kinds of dynamics takes into account things like proportionality of violence. So, you know, the fact that he's much bigger and stronger than her means if they both engage in the same violent action, she's going to sustain more damage. So, you know, she pushes him, it's unlikely she can displace him. He pushes her, and he can, you know, shove her on the ground. She slaps him, it's likely to be annoying and make him feel very disrespected. He slaps her, and look who's bruised tomorrow. Because, you know, he's got bigger hands, he's got more upper body strength, he weighs more in general, so if he follows through with his weight, then he can just hit her harder. And also men tend to have thicker skin and denser bones, which means it's just going to do more impact if they hit you. That's just how that is. So even in a situation where you literally have men and women doing equal amounts of in the same types of sort of physical things, you're going to have a woman who's much more injured. And, you know, when you talk about reactive violence, it's just a thing that's natural, that over time, when you've been attacked enough and victimized enough, actual science shows that people tend to respond by lashing out and fighting back, usually in an effort to assert themselves in some sort of way, in hopes of, like, showing their attacker that, like, hey, this thing you're doing where you just do whatever you want to me, I don't do anything, that's stopping now. Like, I'm asserting myself, I'm making it clear to you that, like, if you do this thing, we're going to have a problem. That's why people do it. That's a thing we know. There's a lot of research that shows that. But then we head to the land of pseudoscience, where we pretend that in situations where people are really harmed, they don't fight back, they don't lash out because they're scared of their abusers, so they would never try to do anything that might make them mad, even though real science shows, no, you actually get mad too. And you actually feel a desire to assert yourself and put your foot down and let it be known you're a person with thoughts and feelings that matters. even if you know that whenever you do that, they're going to hit you for it, because the truth of the matter is that abusers will hit you anyway, and you figure that out when you've been abused long enough. You figure out that no matter how well you adhere to their irrational and arbitrary demands, you still often wind up finding yourself hit by them, which means it's kind of a waste of your life to spend a lot of time and energy trying to please them. But if you've made it to the end of this adventure, thank you. I'm glad you did. Please leave a like for the algorithm, comment also for the algorithm, and subscribe to my channel. There will be more videos, more on this trial, and also more on things that are not this trial. Thank you. Have a good day.